There's a piece of gym wisdom that's been repeated for decades, that smoking weed tanks your testosterone, turns you soft, kills your gains. It's treated as settled fact in most locker rooms. But when you actually look at the current research on this, including a study that came out just this year, the picture is a lot messier and more interesting than a simple yes or no. And some of the newest data is actively contradicting what everybody assumed was already proven. So today I want to walk through what the science on cannabis and testosterone actually shows, including why studies keep landing on completely different answers depending on exactly who they're studying.
So Arthur, No Fee Fitness here. Hello and welcome.
Let's start with where this belief originally came from, because there's real science behind the early version of this story. Laboratory work going back decades found that cannabinoids can directly suppress testosterone production in isolated Leydig cells, the cells inside the testicle responsible for making testosterone, when exposed to high concentrations in a petri dish. More recently, a 2022 study on non-human primates given THC edibles over 7 months found a clear dose-dependent decrease in testosterone along with measurable testicular shrinkage. The proposed mechanism was that THC suppresses the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, which reduces luteinizing hormone from the pituitary, which is the actual signal that tells the testicles to produce testosterone in the first place. That's a coherent, plausible biological pathway, and for a long time, it was treated as the final word on the subject. It also makes some biological sense on the surface because your body already runs its own internal cannabinoid signaling system called the endocannabinoid system. And it has receptors present throughout the same hypothalamic and pituitary tissue that regulates reproductive hormones. Your body's own natural cannabinoids genuinely do interact with testosterone regulation as part of normal physiology, which is exactly why researchers assumed introducing an external cannabinoid at high enough doses could plausibly tip that system out of balance. The theory was never baseless. The question has always been whether the doses and patterns real people actually use translate into a measurable effect outside of a lab setting. Except human tissue doesn't always behave like a petri dish or a primate model. And this is where things get genuinely interesting. A 2023 study took actual human adult testis tissue donated from real patients and exposed it directly to both THC and CBD for up to 9 full days. The researchers measured testosterone production and tracked the physical distribution of Leydig cells throughout that exposure. They found no significant change in testosterone output, no change in Leydig cell distribution, and no increase in cell death, even at the higher end of the concentrations they tested. When they looked at gene expression tied to testosterone production and germ cell development, cannabinoid exposure didn't meaningfully disrupt any of it. In other words, when you take the actual human organ instead of an animal model or an isolated cell line, the acute suppression effect that seemed so clear in earlier research essentially disappears. Now here's where the human population data gets genuinely contradictory. And honestly, this is the part that makes this topic worth taking seriously instead of dismissing with a simple answer. A large 10-year study following more than 7,800 men found that cannabis users actually had higher serum testosterone and better scores on a standardized measure of sexual function compared to non-users. That's the opposite direction of what the old locker room warning predicts. But a separate study specifically looking at men being evaluated for primary infertility, more than 2,000 of them, found that cannabis users in that specific population had lower testosterone and worse sperm morphology compared to non-users in the same clinic. So you've got one large study in the general population showing higher testosterone in users, and another large study specifically in infertile men showing lower testosterone in users. And both are real, published, peer-reviewed findings. The most likely explanation for that contradiction is that these are fundamentally different populations being studied for different reasons, and cannabis use might be interacting with whatever underlying factors already brought each group into the study in the first place, rather than cannabis having one single universal effect on every man's hormones regardless of context. A systematic review and meta-analysis that pooled together the available studies on this exact question ultimately concluded that the current evidence doesn't support a clinically significant association between cannabis use and testicular function overall, while being careful to note that the existing studies are limited and inconsistent enough that a real effect in certain populations or usage patterns can't be ruled out either. And then there's the newest piece of this puzzle, published just this year out of the University of Geneva in collaboration with the Swiss Center for Applied Human Toxicology. Their research found that cannabis use does not lower testosterone in young men, and their data actually pointed toward cannabis potentially increasing testicular testosterone synthesis rather than suppressing it, a finding that directly challenges the assumption that's been repeated in gyms for years. The researchers proposed that cannabis appears to have a direct effect specifically at the level of the testicle itself, rather than working through the brain signaling pathway that the older suppression theory was built around, which would help explain why studies looking only at pituitary hormones like luteinizing hormone sometimes missed what was actually happening locally inside the testicular tissue. As part of that same research, the team identified two new biomarkers linked to cannabis use, specific hormone metabolites called hydroxyprogesterone and dihydroprogesterone, which gives researchers a genuinely new tool to study exactly how cannabis interacts with testicular hormone production going forward, rather than just measuring testosterone alone and treating it as the whole story. It's also worth noting that frequency and duration of use show up as a meaningful variable across this research, even within studies that don't find an overall effect. A retrospective study of infertile men evaluating multiple lifestyle habits together found that when cannabis use was looked at as a standalone factor among a group of 153 men, semen parameters, testosterone, and testicular volume weren't significantly influenced. But other research, specifically comparing monthly, yearly, and lifetime patterns of use, has found that the more frequently and consistently a man uses cannabis over time, the more likely subtle changes in semen parameters become detectable, even in populations where testosterone itself doesn't move much. This suggests that if there's a real biological effect hiding in this data, it's more likely to show up as a dose and duration dependent pattern in heavy, sustained users, rather than as something that applies uniformly to anyone who's ever used cannabis recreationally. There's one more distinction worth making before wrapping this up, because testosterone and fertility are not actually the same question, even though people often talk about them like they are. Even in research where testosterone itself didn't show a clear, consistent effect, several studies have still found associations between heavier cannabis use and measurable changes in sperm morphology and semen quality specifically. So it's entirely possible for a man's testosterone to look completely normal on blood work while his sperm parameters are still being affected, which means these really are two separate questions requiring two separate answers, not one blanket verdict about weed and manhood. So where does that honestly leave you? The old confident claim that cannabis definitively tanks testosterone doesn't hold up well against the newest human tissue research or the largest population studies, some of which point in the opposite direction entirely. But the picture isn't the clean all clear either, since specific populations, specific usage patterns, and semen quality specifically still show inconsistent or negative associations in parts of the literature. This is a genuinely active, unsettled area of research right now, and the honest answer, as unsatisfying as it might be compared to a confident locker room claim, is that the science is still catching up to the question, and anyone giving you a definitive answer in either direction right now is oversimplifying data that the researchers themselves are still actively arguing about. If you're someone who uses cannabis regularly and you're specifically concerned about fertility rather than testosterone itself, that's the piece of this conversation with the more consistent, if still incomplete, evidence behind it. And it's worth a direct conversation with a doctor rather than trying to interpret a single headline about a single study, since the reality here genuinely depends on how much you use, how often, and which specific outcome you're actually worried about.
This is Arthur No Fee Fitness. Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never pay fees for your fitness.